on it, Confederation, or also known as vote rigging. There's actually been two votes to get Newfoundland into Canada. A lot of us are familiar with 1949, and that's the one we're talking about tonight. But they tried in 1869 as well, and the people vehemently turned it down. It was completely voted down, and that was it. And songs came out of that because we are Irish, so we have music being made about what's happening in the society of the day. Songs like Anti-Confederation Song were written in 1869. Um, so the pretty obvious sentiment of the day was, no, we're not joining Canada. Now, fast forward to 1949, and our oil reserves are starting to be kind of noticed. Our potential for mining and that is starting to be noticed, and the British really want us in to Canada because they control Canada. Canada is a constitutional monarchy, and to this day, right now in 2024, is still run through a governor general proxy, which is the Queen's representative, or now the King. So there was a committee to be called. The legislation said that a committee of all Newfoundlanders will be convened, and they will decide about the possibility of a referendum vote. And the committee had rejected the Confederation idea. They didn't even get it to a referendum vote. A committee was reformed, and British subjects were entered into the committee. And when I say British subjects, I don't mean Newfoundlanders. Newfoundlanders, we were a dominion. We were a self-governing dominion. Yes, we were under the Commonwealth, but we were a self-governing dominion. What I mean by British subjects is literal fancy pants wearing, wig wearing guys from England who were part of the Queen's representatives were sent over to stack the deck in the committee to make sure that it went to a referendum vote because they knew they could rig the vote. So a committee was reformed against the legal legislative manner in which it was meant to be formed, i.e. they had illegal immigrants on the committee. And that swayed the vote, and they decided that it should go to a referendum vote. Not only did they decide that, but they also decided that the American option was to be left off the ballot, meaning Newfoundlanders were now only going to be able to decide between joining the Canadian Union or holding responsible government. During the lead up to this, the British started cutting off funding to Newfoundland. So that was heavily propagandized, and we were forced a referendum vote without an American option, which was heavily popular amongst the entire province, realistically. The idea of statehood allowed us our own responsible government with but the protection of a bigger federal union, but still allowed us to have a responsible government of our own. So we go to a heavily propagandized lead up to this vote. We get denied the American option, and we're now told it's Canada or you're on your own. And what you're on your own means is Britain is cutting you off. You're not getting another penny from them, and you have to do it all on your own. This is just after the Great Depression, by the way. Think about this. This is 1940. This is years leading up to 1949. So the idea of being completely cut off from British funding entirely was pretty scary to people.
I got a bit to add to that. I'm just going to add some context to it. I'm going to go back to 1933 because back in 1933 is when the British government came and removed the responsible government we had. Now, the reason they did that is because we owed $40 million to the British government for giving them our men to die in World War I. So what they did was they came in and they removed our government. They said that we had an irresponsible government, and that's the reason we owed $40 million. Now, mind you, this is right after the Great Depression. So every country in the world pretty much owed everybody money, and they were not able to make even the interest payments. Now, most countries, like under Britain rule, all the colonies were forgiven for a period, and interest rates were lowered from 5% to 3%. But for Newfoundland, they came in and they removed our government, and they decided they were going to come in here, take this back for a period until they deemed it Newfoundland was responsible enough to manage its own government. Which in that document they wrote, they didn't specify how we would ask for responsible government back, or under what terms, or when it would even happen. Like there was no deadline on it, right? But it was signed in the document that um, Britain were temporarily taking over our government, and they were going to give it back to Newfoundland. That was the only option until they can return it to responsible government. Which
timeline wise, we're already part of Canada now. That fraud has already happened. We've now been thrusted into Canada, and we get into the mid 1960s, and the provincial government instituted a program that they called centralization. The people here called it resettlement. Or so what they did, and I actually have firsthand knowledge of this because my father's family was resettled while he was alive. For context, my father was born in 1959 on an island called St. Leonard's in Placentia Bay, and uh, the song called "Out from St. Leonard's" was written about the exodus from there because there was a hardy, self-sufficient, self-reliant base of people that were living in small communities that didn't need help from the provincial government. But what the provincial government had over them was control of the electricity, the power going there. You got your relocation letter, you were told that at the end of this program and this date, the power's cut. So if you don't want to go, that's fine, but there's no more power here. So start your fires and hope that you got enough wood and, all this kind of stuff. Now, that was the mid 1960s. We'd just been frauded into giving away our riches, our culture, our potential, our future, literally everything to join Canada. And then our own provincial government, now under the veil of a Canadian government, did that to its own people. And this is the ultimate act of treason. Because a federal cabinet minister, so that means the Ottawa federal Canadian government, they had a cabinet minister, a minister of fisheries and oceans. His name was John Crosbie. He's from Newfoundland, elected to represent Newfoundland, was part of the federal government. They made him Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. And in 1992, overnight, with his pen stroke, cod fishing was banned in Canada. Overnight, 30,000 official on the book jobs were gone like that. It is the largest layoff in Canadian history to this day. Now, 30,000 official jobs, those are commercially registered fishermen. This is not the thousands of fishermen that were just fishing on their own, selling and keeping and feeding their family, like my family. That's what my grandfather did. He wasn't a commercial fisherman. He fished, he kept what he needed to, and sold off what he didn't need to make a bit of money.
I'll jump in there because after the first referendum, it was considered by Newfoundlanders and by the Canadian government. They were curious whether the present Newfoundland system of controlling fish exports would be wrecked by Confederation. So that was between the first and second referendum. So the people knew then that Canada would ruin our fishing industry.
So yeah, 1992. Overnight, the federal government bans cod fishing, and I'm not being facetious when I say that. They banned cod fishing. It was illegal in Canada to codfish after 1992. 30,000 official jobs were lost overnight, and everybody in the province lost their ability to fish for a living, to self sustain. And that decision was made by John Crosbie, who is a born and raised Newfoundlander who was elected in Newfoundland to represent, sit down, please, so I don't shock you, Newfoundlanders. And he made the decision. Obviously, it wasn't just him and him alone, but he was the man responsible, signed the piece of paper that banned cod fishing. So you've been, they tried to throw you into Canada. You said no. So they said, well, fuck you, we'll rig the vote. So they rigged the vote, and then they forced us into Canada. And then they come around and start resettling people, telling people, you can't live here, you got to live here. You can't live here, you got to live there. There. And now, after the resettlement, another 20, 30 years from that, you notice it always like it misses a little generation, right? Because you can't do things too quickly. You have to boil the frog slowly enough that he doesn't realize he's being boiled until it's too late. So it starts, a first attempt in the late 1800s. They finally get that right in 1940, and subsequently in 1949 with the actual rigged vote. And then they have to wait until the 1960s to start resettling and relocating people. And then they have to wait until 1992 before they can shut down your entire provincial industry and not have you stand up and say, fuck you. A couple of hundred fishermen went down to the wharf and started yelling at the minister, and he yelled back at them. And it's this cool little clip that a lot of Newfoundlanders like to hear. But that's it. That's all that happened. We sat there, we took it because it had been generationally done to us so far back so many times. So now what we're allowed to do is during the summer, on Saturdays and Sundays, we're allowed to go out and fish, and we're allowed to catch 5 fish per person per day during the summer on weekends. So that's what I grew up as being normal. Like when I started, 8, 9, 10 years old, going fishing with my pop, we can't fish on a Tuesday. Why not, Pop? It's a beautiful day. Let's go hop in your boat. Well, the government says you're not allowed to, right? Oh, okay. Well, that's the rule. Oh, fair enough. That's how I grew up. That was normal. So, but the generation before, like my father, grew up fishing to self sustain. He was 30-ish years old when the cod moratorium happened. It was his generation. It was up to him to say no to that. But they had already been normalized because guess what? He was relocated, he was resettled. He grew up as a 5, 6 year old boy watching the government come in and say, no, 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 you can't live there. You got to live here. You got to do this. You got to do that. And the parents, his parents said, well, I guess so, because everybody else's parents did. So it was already normalized for him to see the federal government come in and say, no fishing. Because he watched in his childhood somebody come in and say, no living there. You live where I tell you to live. And that was normal for his father because his father, 30 years before that, was told, no, you're not allowed to be a free person. You're not allowed to choose for yourself. We are going to choose what you do, what your province does, what your nation does. We are going to decide the fate of your island, the fate of your economy, and everything. And he, at the time, and all the people at the time stood around and said, well, sure, I guess, fine, whatever. Nobody did what was enough to stop it from happening. So generationally, just like the slow-boiled frog, continuously getting attacked.